I will be using Embrilliance Essential software to add background quilting designs to the files of the Hometown Quilt. Now for the quilt I'll be doing, I am going to make some major changes in how I quilt this project. So let me tell you about how the directions call to make this quilt. The directions call to use a heavy tearaway stabilizer. The blocks would be sewn with that stabilizer, which is then removed when the block is finished. And then all of the blocks would be sewn together to make the quilt top. And so when this quilt top is finished, there would be no stabilizer. It would be just essentially a regular quilt top, other than the fact that the actual blocks were made with an embroidery machine. Then you would take the quilt top and quilt it like a traditional quilt. You would take the quilt top and add batting and a backing and then quilt the top together. You could take that to a long armor. You could do that on a sewing machine. You could use your embroidery machine to do the quilting. And the quilting would be done over all of the blocks that you've already finished. So that's how the directions are for this hometown quilt. I am going to be doing the quilting and adding the batting as I stitch each block out. And so this is, again, not how the directions call to do this. I am going to do this, if you are familiar with Kimberbell, just like I do my projects with Kimberbell. Each block that I stitch out, I will start with batting. I will do some background quilting on the base fabric of the block. And in this case, there are two fabrics that make up each block base fabric. So there's essentially a sky fabric and then a strip that is grass fabric. And so I am going to, again, add batting and quilting on top of that before I stitch out the house block. So let me jump ahead to the trimming instructions. Now, of course, there are two sizes to this quilt. You can do the large size that will be trimmed to 11 by 11, or the smaller size, which is the size I'm doing, and this will be trimmed 7.5 to 7.5. And so these are not typical quilt size blocks. And so when I go to add my quilting, I need to take a few things into consideration. Now, first, let me note that while what I'm going to do really isn't complicated, it is a little bit more involved because I have chosen to do a quilting background for the sky and a different quilting background for the grass. Now, if that's something that you don't really want to do, or if this seems too complicated, you could, for example, take an 8 by 8 background quilting design. It can be from any designer, or larger, I guess, anything that could fit in your hoop that would go over your fabric. And once you get to the step where the sky and the grass are seamed together and ready to go, you could just quilt a larger background quilting and have the same design over the whole block. Then you can move on to do all of the applique, finish the block, and then trim as the directions give you. That would be an easier way to do this block with background quilting. However, again, I'm going to do a different background for the sky and the grass. And when I'm setting up my design in Embrilliance Essential software, I'm going to have to be a little bit more precise because of how this block is trimmed. Now, if you notice, they give a measurement on where a ruler needs to line up with this grass seam. Of course, whether you're doing the large or the small. Now, this will need to be lined up to 1.5 inches on the ruler. That's only if you are using Lori Holt's 7.5 inch ruler, and that includes a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the outside of the ruler. So this little teal border adds a 1/4 inch. So when this project says to line this ruler up at the 1.5 inch mark. It is 1.5 inches, but then it adds 1/4 inch, which means that when this is actually cut, this measurement from the seam to the cut line is actually 1 3/4 inch. It's the 1.5 inch plus the seam allowance. So that's great if you have Lori Holt's ruler, you line it up with the 1.5 inch and you trim all the way around. If you're using a regular ruler and don't want to purchase this, which you don't have to, I would mark this to 1 3/4, and then you would have the right distance to trim with the regular ruler. So with that being said, I needed to show how this is trimmed to show you how I'm going to be setting up the background quilting that I've chosen to do. Now I do want to note that there are rows of sashing blocks between the house rows, and there are 20 of these blocks that make up the sashing rows for the entire quilt. Each block has 2 of these quilt looking blocks per sashing block. And I will be adding batting to these blocks so that it's the same as the house block. However, these will not have additional background quilting. And the reason for that is these blocks will be pieced with fabric, and then all of this design that you see that looks like it would be, a traditional quilt block, this is all embroidery. And so these are very stitch heavy, and these particular blocks will not need additional quilting. So when I open Embrilliance, I'm going to start with these sashing blocks, because all I have to do to get these to where I'm ready to stitch is to add some batting placement lines and a batting tack down line, and then the actual quilt block. So I will start with these, and then that will kind of give us a jump onto working on the house blocks. So let's get into Embrilliance, and we'll start with the sashing blocks. I have opened Embrilliance Essential Software, and in order to bring in files, you can use the merge stitch file icon on the top toolbar. However, when you do this, you would navigate to where you keep your files, and we are bringing in quite a few files. And so if I were to use this icon, I would have to navigate every time to where I keep those files. So an easier way and a faster way is to just open wherever you have your file saved. Now on my desktop, I have a file folder called Embroidery, and I leave it there so I can access it easy. I do also back this up on a couple of external hard drives. But in this folder, I have all of my different patterns in folders depending on the designer. So the first thing I'm going to do is come to the Lori Holt Hometown Quilt folder. I'm going to open that up, and there are 6x10 files for the smaller quilt, which is the size I'm doing, and then there is a folder for the large quilt for the 8x12, and then the directions. Now this combined files folder is a folder that I made, and whenever I do any sort of editing or merging files for a project, I always make a combined files folder, and that way they don't mix with just the regular files that come with the project when you purchase it. And so this is the folder that I made. So the first thing I'll do is open the 6x10 embroidery files folder, and this has all of the house blocks, the 12 house blocks, and all 20 of the sashing blocks for the smaller quilt. And so I will bring in that very first sashing block. I will just drag and drop it into the hoop. Now with this block, the very first step that will be done right on the stabilizer is a placement line for the fabric. And in order to make the base of this block, it will be a flip and fold where the fabric is tacked down, flipped over, and that will happen with several pieces of fabric to make up, again, the base or the background of this block. And so it will do some tack down of the fabric. For example, this little box is a tack down of those fabrics before moving on. And so this very outer line is part of the tack down of the fabric. And then you'll notice that there is a smaller inner box that if I scroll to the very bottom, the very last step is it's really not a tack down because the fabric's already been tacked down, but it is a trimming guide. And so this very last step, if you look up at the size, it is a 3 by 6.5 inch rectangle. So that will be the last step, and then that will be used to trim it to size. Now, because I want to add batting so that these fabrics or these blocks will be the same as the house blocks that I'm going to add batting to, I need to add a batting placement so that I know where to place my batting before I start the block. So the easiest way for me to do that is to select that final trim size, and I am going to Command C and then Command V to paste. And so that pastes a second copy. You can see right at the bottom, and it's right now the exact same size. However, I need to change the size because I don't want my batting to be the same as the trim size. If I leave it the same size, then when I go to sew this block to the block next to it and trim and sew a 1/4 inch for my seam allowance, I will have batting in my seams, and that's what I don't want. So this box that I just made, I need to make smaller, and I need it to be a 1/4 inch smaller than what it is right now. And so if I come up to this size, I need to make this batting placement 2.5 by 6, which is a 1/2 inch smaller, which means it'll be a 1/4 inch on all 4 sides. So I will just, with this lock unlocked, I'm going to change that 3 to 2.5. And then this 6, I can just delete off that 1/2 inch and have that 6. So now, if you look, there are those wider tack down of the fabric. Then there was this box, which is the very last step. That is the trimming size. And now there is a box smaller than that, and that is the batting placement. Now I'm going to select that batting placement, select the swatch, and just change color so it's easier to see. So if I change that to purple, now you can see where that lands, and that is right where the seam will be when I'm sewing it to the block next to it. Now, I need this to be the first step because, of course, the batting has to go down before we do the block. Right now, it's the last step. So I am going to select that box, and I'm going to right-click and move first. That will put the batting placement, the very first step, which is what I want. Now, normally when I do quilting where I add the batting and quilting, I don't run a batting tack down, and that's because I normally cut my batting exactly to size. So if this were something I was normally doing, I would run the placement for the batting. I would have my batting cut to exactly 2.5 by 6, and I would place it down and then just start working on the background fabric. However, I think I'm going to add a batting tack down because of all of this embroidery. All of this design for these blocks is stitching, and so I really want that batting to be tacked down. Even though the fabric will be, tacked down, all these lines will be stitching, and there will be an outer tack down line of the fabric. It's not going to tack all of this area of the batting. And so in order for me to make a batting tack down, I will just select that first batting placement. I will Command C to copy and Command V to paste. That gives me just exactly the same size. And so, of course, I do need that to be the second step. So I can either move early, right click and move earlier, or move to first. I'll just hit move earlier. those are identical, and so it didn't matter which one was first or second. Now, I will say that typically when there is a tack down stitch of batting, it usually is two passes, 2 rounds of stitching. I could, if I wanted to make that 2 rounds of stitching, I could copy and make a third so that there would be a batting placement, and I could place my batting that will be a little bit larger. The second step would be tacking that down and then trimming. So I am just going to leave it at 1 stitch to tack that down, and I'll just be careful when I'm trimming the batting to size that I don't cut that stitching. So then after those two, it would go and start the placement of the fabric, which would be right over the top of the batting. Now I am going to select one of these batting placement lines, and I'm going to change the color. Right now they're both this dark purple, and I am not going to color sort this design, but I'm not sure if I take this to my machine and these two steps are the same color, if my machine is going to automatically run those together without stopping, and that's what I don't want because I do need to be able to place my batting. So just to make sure, I am going to select one of them. It can be either the first or the second, and I am just going to make it a different color purple. So I will just choose the next one above it and select OK. So now I have the first batting placement. I'll place my batting. I have the second step, which will tack the batting down, and then I will trim it, and then I will start the actual block. And so that is all I need to do for these sashing blocks. Now I do want to make sure that these are centered. They should be centered, but I'm going to select this first design, this first box that I made, and I'm going to come to Utility and Center and Hoop, and you can see it did move just a tiny bit. The second, I will come to Utility and Center and Hoop, and that moved a little bit. And then this should already be centered because when I brought it in, I haven't made any changes. That should be centered in the hoop, but I'm going to go ahead and just make sure. And that didn't move, so it was centered. I just wanted to make sure that those boxes that I added and then changed the size. Sometimes you saw how minimally it moved, but because I changed the size, it wasn't exactly in the center. And of course I want those placements to be exactly in the center. So now this block is done, and I am going to come to File, Save Stitch File As, and I am going to be putting it into my Combined Files folder. Again, that's in that main embroidery folder on my desktop that I also wanted to note that I do keep backups of on external hard drives. I keep it on my desktop for easy access. Then in the hometown, the Lori Holt hometown quilt, and then I have that Combined Files folder. And because I've made changes and merged and done, all sorts of things in software, I don't want to add it to the original files for the embroidery. So I will select my Combined Files folder, and I'm going to name this Sashing 1, and that's just because we have 20, and so I just need to give them each a different name. So now this one is done, and I have 19 more blocks to do. However, I've made changes that I don't want to have to make every time I bring a block in because that would be silly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select that actual block, which is now the third step, and I'm going to delete. So now I'm just left with the placement of the batting and then the tack down of the batting. So now I can come back to my embroidery files folder. I will choose the second block and drag and drop it into the hoop. And it's nice that it highlights because there's a lot of blocks, and so every time I come back I know which one I have already brought in, so I just go to the next without having to look at the names. There's a lot of words and numbers in these block names. So I've put that second block it comes in centered, and that's all I have to do. I already have the first 2 steps, and then we'll start the third. And so I don't need to do anything else. So I will come to File, Save Stitch File As. I will just select where I named this Sashing 1, and that's just so that I don't have to type Sashing every single time. I will just come delete the 1 and add 2. Now I can delete this, go back to my embroidery files folder, bring in number 3. There's nothing else that I have to do, and save. Change the 2 to a 3. Then I can select that and delete. I'll bring in 4. It's ready to go. Again, when you bring something in, it centers in the hoop, and then those first 2 I centered. So I go to File, Save Stitch File As. I will select Sashing 3, change to 4, and save. Now I will delete that and go back. Now with Sashing 5, this is the end of the first row of sashings, and this is going to be different for each of the last sashing blocks of those 4 rows. And so this is number 5, and so the changes I'm going to make now will be for blocks 5, 10, 15, and 20. So here is number 5. I've saved these first 4, and looking right away, you can tell that this block looks different. It's got a rectangle on the top and the bottom, whereas the ones that I just did, those first 4, do not have that full rectangle. And so I know that this is different. So if I drag and drop this 5, you can see that there's a lot more space, and it's not the same size. So if I open that block up, first you'll notice that there's 20 steps instead of just 16. Remember the other ones, it ended with step 16, and that was that stitching guide. This one goes to 20, and it's the stitching guide, and you can see that now this one is 3 by 7 instead of 3 by 6.5. And that is because the very end sashing blocks, so there will be 4 of them because there's 4 rows, has an additional piece of fabric to make the end even. And so I need to make different changes to this longer block. Now I don't want to make the changes in this first page that I have now, because I still have all of those other blocks. There's 16 that are the short blocks. I've done 4, so I have 12 more to do, and so I don't want to change this on this page. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select everything on this page, and I'm going to Command C to copy. You can right click to copy. I'll come to a new page, and I'm going to paste. So now I have 2 pages, one for the smaller blocks that I've done. I'm going to go ahead and select this block and just delete it because I know that's ready for the next regular block. I'll come to page 2, and you can see that I need to make changes to the length of my batting placement and tack down. So if I select that first batting placement, it's 2.5 by 6. I need to make this 2.5 by 6.5 because that final outline of this block is 3 by 7. So I need to make it a 1/2 inch smaller than 3 by 7. So I'll select that first batting tack down, and I will just add a 0.5 to that 6 measurement. And that now makes this first step 2.5 by 6.5, and you can tell that that now fits better. I will do the same to the second. I'll select the second. I need to just change this 6 to 6.5. So that that second is also 2.5 by 6.5. Now, because I made some changes to the size, I am going to re-select each of those, come to utility and center and hoop, and I'm not sure you can see, but it moved a tiny bit. I'll do the same thing with the second. It moved a tiny bit. The third came in centered, but you know, sometimes I just like to do that, and it didn't move, so we're good. So I just wanted to make sure that those first two steps were exactly in the center. So now this one is ready to go. I have the batting placement, which is 2.5 by 6.5. I'll place my batting. I will run the tack down, which is the same, 2.5 by 6.5, and then I will trim my batting and then start the block. So this is done, and now this essentially template with those two first steps are done for the next blocks that are longer. So I will come to File, Save Stitch File As, and I will select Sashing 4 and just change that to 5. And then I will select and delete that, and that will be ready for the next long block. So now I will come back to that first page. I know I've done 5, so now I need to do 4 more, which would be 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then that next block, 10, you can see it has the rectangle. I would go back to page 2, add 10 to this block, and save. So I will continue and do all 20 blocks. So I will have a total of 16 blocks saved with this smaller placement lines, which is my page 1. And I will have 4 blocks that have the longer template, the longer placement lines, and they will all be added to my combined files folder. So let me get to that point, and then we can start working on the house blocks. So I've done all 20, and I'm still on that very last longer block, which is the very last sashing block. So I am just going to, with this page, just delete it. I don't need to save it. I've saved all of those that I need. So now I'm on my first page that had those smaller placement lines. I'm just going to select both of those and delete. And I'm going to start with just a fresh page and bring in my first house block. So to bring in the first house block, I'll just go back to that same folder, scroll to the top, and drag and drop that house number 1. Now, if you are to stitch these as is, these smaller blocks will fit in a 6 by 10 hoop, which is why they're labeled 6 by 10. However, with the changes I'm going to be making, they will not fit into a 6 by 10. You could stitch these into I think they'll fit into an 8 by 12. I am actually going to stitch them in a 9 by 14 so that I can stitch them. I'm going to rotate and stitch them right facing. So the first thing I'm going to do is select that house and come up to the rotate and rotate to the left. And this is how I'm going to put it into my 9 by 14 inch hoop and stitch out. So we have similar changes to make that I did the sashing. Of course, it's going to be a little bit more involved because then we're going to be adding quilting, and we do have to make some changes to the order of some stitching. But this is how the block comes in. Now, I want to note that similar to the sashing blocks, the very first step is to place that stitching line or the placement line right on the stabilizer. This is where the sky fabric and the grass fabric will be placed. It's very similar to the sashing blocks where you would place those, you would tack it down, and then you would flip that grass piece over. So this is another, the very beginning is another flip and fold. And then the next step they have, step 3, is their tack down of that fabric. Because this has a lot of stitching, a lot of applique, of course it's always a good idea to have fabric tacked down. And so I want to note a few things. Now,
beginning, when I started talking about these blocks, I mentioned that the trim size is going to be 7.5 inch by 7.5 inch, which means that when these are sewn to the blocks next to it, they will become 7-inch square finished blocks. But if you notice this tack down and look at the size, it is only say 6.5 by 6 inches. And I'm honestly not really sure why they made the tack down this small, because if I were to run the tack down, this would all have to be taken out, all of that stitching, and then there's a chance that the holes from that tack down stitch will be visible because it's smaller than the finished size, even when the quilt top is sewn together. So I'm not really sure why they didn't make it larger, but they didn't. So I am going to use this similar as I did the sashing as kind of a guide to get me started on my batting placement. So right now I have step 3 selected. I'm going to Command C and Command V. That will paste an exact copy of that step and put it at the bottom. Now I am going to use this as my batting placement, so I'm going to select that, right click and move to first because I need that to be the first step. Now I need to change the size because the size is not what I need it to be. So the size that I want the batting placement is to be 7 inches. Remember, the trim size is 7.5 by 7.5, so I want my batting 1/4 of an inch smaller on all sides so that when I do stitch this to the block next to it, there's no batting in that seam allowance. So I've got this box selected, and I'm going to come up and change this to 7 by 7 inches. And then the first thing, while it's still highlighted, I'm going to go to Utility and Center in Hoop. So now this is my batting placement. Now I need a trim size. Now my trim size will be that 7.5 by 7.5. So I am going to make a, I don't need to make a copy because I already have the smaller one copied. So I'm just going to Command V to paste. It's going to paste another one of those smaller boxes. I'm going to right click and move earlier. So now that is the second step. It is still highlighted, and so I want to change this one to 7.5 by 7.5, and this will be the tack down of the fabric after I get it quilted and before I start all the house blocks, and then it will eventually help me when I'm centering my 7.5-inch ruler. It will kind of give me a guide as to where that needs to go. Now I will select that second step. I'm going to go to Utility and Center and Hoop, and you can see it move just slightly. So now this third step that I copied and pasted, I am not going to use at all. It's too small. It's not what I want. So I am going to select it on the right hand side, and I'm going to hit delete on my keyboard because I don't need it at all. So now if you look at this block, I've got the batting placement. Now I am going to cut my batting exactly to size. So I'm going to cut my batting 7 by 7. And the reason I don't need to tack my batting down is because I'm going to add background quilting, and I'll have the fabric tacked down. I'll do all my background quilting. So this is what I do when I do Kimberbell. I cut my batting to size and then I do the quilting, and I don't need to really tack it down. However, you could, if you wanted to tack down your batting and trim it, you could just make a second copy of this very first step and make sure that you change the color so your machine stops, place your batting, then run essentially the same step again, trim your batting and move on. I'm not going to do that. So looking at this block, I'm going to be putting one quilting design in the sky and a different quilting design in the grass. Again, you could choose one quilting design that goes over both, and that would be fine. So it looks like I'm ready just to add my quilting and be done. However, there is one more step that I need to do. I didn't find this out until I stitched a sample, and I stitched my background quilting and kind of was trimming it just to make sure everything was right. I didn't go through and stitch the whole house, but remember when I showed how to trim this, I am using Lori Holt's ruler, and so I needed to line up that 1.5 inch mark and then trim. And when I went to trim my little sample, my batting was this was not in the right it wasn't right. And so I was like, wait, that's not in the right way. Everything was shifted up a little bit. Even though everything's centered in the hoop, there are some changes that I need to make. And so I know that that seems confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the 7.5 inch, and I'm going to make a copy and paste it. That will paste it down to the bottom. This is something I'm not going to keep. It's just for alignment purposes, and I'll show you. So I am going to change the color so that it looks different and it's easy to tell which, what this is. And so I will just select a purple. Now, when I was talking about the ruler and lining up, remember it's 1.5 inches on Lori Holt's ruler, but it's really 1.75 inches from the seam line, which this green line, when the fabric is folded, the grass fabric is flipped over and folded, this green line becomes this, the seam line between the sky and the grass. So the directions call to line up that ruler right at the seam line, and it would be 1.5 inches on her ruler, but then there was the 1/4 inch seam added to her ruler, so it's really 1.75 inches from this seam line to the bottom trim line. So I'm going to select this purple, and I'm going to make it 1.75, which is 1 3/4 inch, because that's going to be lined up with this grass line or the seam line. So now you can see that my 1.75 inch measurement, which is where the block will be trimmed, is not where that 7.5 inch trim line is. Those need to be the same. And so I know that this is kind of confusing, and this really wouldn't matter if I wasn't doing a border that was going to fit right within this grass. And this is why I mentioned earlier that if you wanted to, say, pick an 8x8 background quilting that goes over the whole thing, and the quilting would go outside of that cut line, that would be fine and much easier, because you wouldn't need to make the changes that I'm going to be making right now. So I hope that this isn't too, confusing that I'm explaining it. Again, this little purple box is from this seam line down to the bottom of the purple is 1.75 inches, and that's where the block will be trimmed according to the directions. So I need to move both of these boxes down so that the trim placement line, or the tack down line that I made to hold that fabric down, lines up with the bottom of this purple rectangle. So again, I hope that I just haven't confused you. So I'm going to go into this right hand side, and I'm going to select the first, and then hold my shift key down and select the second. That selects both of those boxes, and I am going to just move them down with my arrow key until they line up with the bottom of this purple box. So now you can see that if I move this purple box out of the way, that when I place my batting, do my fabric, run this outside tack down, which becomes kind of a guide to trim, now that bottom trim line is 1.75 inches like it needs to be per the directions. And that's because I just used this little rectangle box, made it 1.75 inches so that I knew it lined up with the seam and lined up with my tack down line. So I am done with this little purple box. So I'm going to select that and just hit delete. So what that means is that everything isn't centered to each other. Because if I went to if I selected these two boxes and went to center in the hoop, it would move back up to where it was. So these are not centered in the hoop per se, but they are aligned where they need to be to cut them per the directions. So now if I look at these steps, I have the batting placement. I'll place my batting. It's going to be cut exactly to size. Then it moves to the tack down of the fabric, but we haven't placed any fabric yet because the fabric placement doesn't start until the block design. Step one is the placement. I would place the fabric, tack it down, flip it, and move. So now I need to get these two steps and move them between step one and step two. So the easiest that I find is I'm going to select that first placement, hold my shift key down, select that second, tack down, and I'm going to Command C to copy and Command V to paste. That will paste only those two at the bottom. So now before I do anything, I'm going to come back up to those two I copied, select them both again, and delete those. I don't want them running with the rest of the house because, I need them in a different order. So now they are the bottom step, of course, because that's what happens when you paste something or bring something in, it puts it at the bottom. So now with that step selected, I am going to right click and move earlier. That makes that step 3. I need to do that one more time because I need those between step 1 and 2. So I will right click, move earlier again, and now that puts that at step 2. So now I have the batting placement. Then I have the placement for the fabric. I'll place both fabrics, tack that fabric down, flip, and I can finger press, press with an iron, use tape, spray, whatever I want to do to make those flat. Then step 3 would be that tack down, which will kind of be a guide to trimming. And it will tack that fabric down, and then I can start on the house. And so now I've got everything where I need to set up, and now I need to add my background quilting. Now I do want to note that you can see that there's not a lot of space that needs quilting in this block, and so again, this is something that's totally optional. You could probably even just do this quilt and stitch in the ditch if you didn't want to add background quilting or quilt on top of all of this. However, I am going to add just the background quilting to these two parts of the design. So let's add those and we'll be close to being finished with this block. Now to add the background quilting, I will just go back to my file folder and go all the way back to where I have all of my designs. I'm going to choose Kimberbell. You can use, any background quilting that you have. It doesn't have to be Kimberbell. And I will go to the quilting designs. And for this bottom grass piece, I am going to use Plant Border 1. And I'm going to use clear blue tiles. Now, if you use Kimberbell, a lot of their designs have a block by block and a clear blue tiles. The only difference between these two are the block by block has the batting placement and tack down and the fabric placement and tack down and then the quilting. But because I've already added my own placement, I am going to use the clear blue tiles. The clear blue tiles is only the quilting design and not all the placement designs. So I'll open the clear blue tiles and I'm going to choose the 2x7, and it's kind of just a grassy looking quilting design. I'm going to select it and rotate it and move it down to the grass area. And it's right in between my batting, which is great. If it went over, I could either shrink it a little bit or just leave it. It doesn't matter if you know, some of my stitching goes into the seam allowance. And it looks, if you look at it, it kind of looks like it's too big, but remember, this is going to be done before any of the applique. And so some of these peaks that go over the design will be under those appliques. And so I'm just going to leave it as is so that I can get most of that bottom grass section quilted. Now I see a few, you can see a few of these go below. That's fine. That doesn't bother me. You could select that and just nudge it up a little bit. But it doesn't really matter, again, if that quilting goes into the seam allowance. So that's all I need to do with my grass. Now I'll go back to that Kimberbell Quilting Designs, and I'm going to use Weather 2. Again, I'm going to use the clear blue tiles. That is only the background quilting. And I am going to bring in the 6x8 vertical. I'll drag and drop that, and then I will select these clouds and rotate them. Now you can see that those are too big. They go way down into the grass, and so I'm going to select and just make it a little bit smaller. Now you can make things smaller to an extent in Embrilliance, and it will let you do that, and it usually doesn't affect the stitch out. You could always try a sample first. And you can't just make a design as small as you want. It will stop at some point when the software, you know, when that there's too much adjustment. So I can make this a little bit smaller. I want to fit it right in between or inside my batting placement. So here's my batting placement, and then I want to just nudge it up towards the top. And it doesn't quite go to the seam, but I'm okay. You know, some of this grass didn't go all the way to the seam, but it's generally filled out in that sky area. And so I like that, so I'm going to leave it like that. Now, of course, because I just added those in, those are the last two steps. And of course, I need that quilting before the house is, you know, started. So I could right click each of these and, you know, move above and or move earlier until I got those situated. However, the fastest, easiest way is selecting the house design. That just needs to be the last design. I'll select that, right click, and move last. So now the order of my steps are the placement of my batting, the placement and tack down of the fabric, and I'll flip and fold it. Then it will run the tack down of that fabric to keep that background fabric, you know, secure. Then it will run the grass background quilting, the cloud background quilting, and then the house. Now there are two more things that I need to do, and then our template is done. So right now, the background quilting have the same color, and I could use the same color for them. This will just be, you know, kind of in the background. It's not something that I necessarily want people to look at and say, oh, there's clouds as the quilting, or oh, there's grass. This is just to hold the batting in, give texture, and the quilting, you know, for me is done. And so I am going to do different colors. For the clouds, I am going to do a color that blends with the background fabric of this sky fabric. And the grass, I think I'm just going to do a dark green. There are several green fabrics used throughout for the grass, and so it might be seen a little bit more on some of the grass versus, you know, the other grass because the fabric's different. But I think I'm just going to use a dark green. Again, this is meant to really kind of just blend in. So I need my machine to stop between these two quiltings, and as I mentioned in the sashing blocks, I'm not sure if taking these to my machine, because these are the same color and they're right next to each other, if my machine is going to distinguish that I need those to stop, or if it would run one right after another without stopping. I'm not color sorting, but I'm still not sure if that my machine would do that. So I just have the cloud selected. I'll select the swatch, And I am just going to change it to a different color. It doesn't matter, you know, which one. Of course, it has nothing to do with the color that you stitch it. It just tells the machine to stop. So I've got those separated. Now there's one other thing I'm going to do. You'll notice that this highlighted yellow means that I if it's red, that means it's too big for my hoop. I think the yellow might mean that it's pretty close to being too big for my hoop. I'm not exactly sure, but I know that that's a warning. So I'm going to come up to step 2, which are these placement and tack down of the background fabric. And I am just going to use this arrow and nudge these in to make them a hair bit smaller. So now that is gone, that yellow highlight is gone, and it's just a tiny bit smaller. And that works perfect because now this is ready to be saved. So this is my house one. I'm going to come to File, Save Stitch File As. I'll put it into that same combined files folder, and I'm going to name it House 1. And then that one is done. Now, of course, I am not going to make all those changes to every house. So I will select this house, which is that final 6th step, and I'm just going to delete it. So now essentially, I just have this template. So I just need to bring in the second house. But now noticing, actually, I am going to make one more change. This peak of these flowers, of the peaks of this grass come right to where that seam is. And I think I am going to make that a little bit smaller. I'm going to undo so it brings my house back. And I am going to just select that grass and just nudge it down just a little bit. It probably wouldn't matter, but that's what I'm going to do. So now I'm going to resave this. Go to File, Save Stitch File As. I already have house 1. I'll just select that and save, and it'll ask me if it wants to replace it because I already have a house 1, so I will just replace. And so now I can select this house and delete. So now you can see that I'm just not quite right at that where that seam is. Again, I don't know if that would really make a difference. But again, now I essentially have my template. So I will go back to my files. I will go to my Lori Holt file, back to the 6x10 embroidery files, and I brought and finished house 1. So now I will just drag and drop house 2. Now again, it comes in sideways because that's how it fits into a 6x10 block. I'll select that, a 6x10 hoop. I will select that and rotate it. And now we have some changes to make, but you'll note something, that these placement and tack down lines of that fabric where it meets the house are not in the same place, and they need to be in order for this house to stitch in the correct place. So I am going to select this house and I'm going to move it up so that those green and red placement and tack down lines are even. So now that I know that this second house is where it needs to be in relation to how the block is going to be trimmed, because I had to do all that changing. So now I come to this house steps, and remember, this has the placement for the fabric, the tack down of the fabric, and that smaller square that was a tack down in the original design. I don't need any of those 3. So I'm going to select the first, hold my shift key down and select the third. So all 3 of those steps are selected. I'm going to hit delete. So now I know that this house is in the correct position because I lined up with these 2 that will be the actual placement and tack down. I hope that makes sense. So now that's all I need to do for house 2. So I will come to File, Save Stitch File As. I will select house 1 just so that I don't have to type house every time, and just change the 1 to a 2 and save it. And then this is exactly the same as with the sashing. I will just delete that design, bring in the next design, and I need to rotate, and I can see that, this is not lined up, so I will bump it up. And I know it's kind of hard to see. It's kind of hard to see in person, but you can bump it up. And if you don't get quite there, just select it again and move it as close as you can to overlap these red and green lines to the ones that we made and shortened. So now once that's done, again, I will come to the steps of the house and select the first, hold my shift key down, select the third, and delete all 3 of those first steps. Then I will come to File, Save Stitch File As. I'll select House 2 and change the 2 to a 3. Select Delete, and I will do that until I have the 12 house files done. Now I have all 12 houses saved, and I am going to go ahead and save this background quilting as a template just in case I ever need it. I did a lot of work to get it to this place, and so if for some reason I need that, I have it saved just on its own. So I will select File, Save Stitch File As. I will put it into that same combined files folder, and I will just name my design and save it, and it's there if I ever need it. So now we can get ready to stitch out our first house.